Hello, this is Dr. Dilip Amin from Interfaith Shadi. I have guided some 1,200 youths in interfaith love relationships and have summarized my experiences of 18 years in several books, as you can see here. The issues in interfaith marriages gets worse as the time comes to decide the religion of children. A couple, let's say in 20s, when they are discussing in some generality how we will raise the children, there is no way they can think exactly what situation they will end up getting into it. They have no clue about what actually they may get into legal trouble when they decide to have the child custody after the divorce. So today we have a special guest, Raj Yerashi, who is an American-born Hindu. Raj is a graduate of Harvard University and worked in finance. He married a Jewish woman, assuming the marriage will be an interfaith marriage with equality. Hinduism and Judaism. However, that changed when they separated and the Jewish woman wanted to raise their children in given formal Jewish education. Let's hear it all from Raj. Welcome, Raj, to Interfaith Shadi.
Thank you, Dilipji. Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. And I thank you for all your advice as well, which has helped me as I've been going through this, and also everything that you're doing for the community.
So I understand you want to preface this interview with some comments. So please go ahead.
Yes, first, in tackling what I think is an important civil rights issue, in addition to talking about other people's experiences, I'll be talking about my own experience. In my case, I'm divorced with 2 young children whom I share 50-50 custody with my ex-wife, a Jewish American. Our children are being raised in both the Hindu and Jewish faiths. I've always been supportive. I continue to be supportive of their interfaith upbringing. I think their lives will be richer for having 2 great traditions to draw from as they get older. And I have believed that both their Hindu and Jewish upbringings to be equally important. As a result of that, I ended up in New Jersey family law court to protect a Hindu religious activity my children and I have been practicing with respect to a timing conflict with a Jewish religious activity my ex-wife wanted the children to do on my time. The court ruled against me on this, prioritizing the Jewish religious activity over the Hindu one, which I respectfully disagree with. However, more significantly, the court went further and declared me to be in bad faith for filing my motion and penalized me financially. This was very, very surprising to me, as I, in my opinion, was just trying to protect a legitimate religious activity via the legal process. And I would have thought that would be covered by freedom of religion. Everything I submitted was also accurate and respectful. So I became very interested in how this could happen. I started reaching out to folks, and the more I talked to more Hindu Americans, the more I heard similar stories, and in many cases with far worse outcomes than mine, which grand scheme of things was not that bad, but more concerned about what's happened to other folks. Now, I have the greatest respect for judges. I've had friends who are judges, and I think they're by and large well-intentioned, and certainly you have to be intelligent. But our community, Hindu Americans, we're a tiny community here and relatively new. So after talking to more and more people, I've concluded that these rulings reflect really a lack of knowledge about Hindu beliefs and practices. And unfortunately, how that plays out in practice in the family law system creates a form of what I would characterize as systemic bias that works against the Hindu American community. Now, I'm a private individual, and I normally wouldn't share this kind of personal experience, but I feel I have to here because it's needed to address this systemic bias. My hope by doing this is to encourage other Hindu Americans to also share their experiences, so we can build momentum for what I think is a very sensible, hopefully easy to achieve legal reform that even judges, I think, would appreciate. Now, I can obviously only speak from my perspective, but I do wish to be respectful of everyone else involved. I will have to cover the positions and evidence presented in court in my case, so that people can consider those alongside the court's ruling to assess the systemic bias for themselves. But I'll be doing the best to present everything as fairly as I can and really focus just on how, different judges could view the same facts very differently. The second thing I wanted to say is my experience happens to involve a dispute between myself, a Hindu American, and a Jewish American, but it could just as easily have been a dispute between people of other faiths.
Mm-hmm.
I also have a lot of Jewish friends, many of them near and dear to my heart, some of whom I actually consulted and quoted in my case. They were extremely supportive of me, and they were as disappointed by the outcome as my Hindu friends. I'm saying this because, as you know, there's been a recent rise in anti-Semitism, which I, of course, 100% condemn. And I just want to be extra sensitive right now, given what's going on in the world, and make sure that nothing I say is taken the wrong way or contributes to that, especially among members of our community, which have long had a great relationship with the Jewish community. Personally, if anything, I've come out of this with more respect for my Jewish friends and given how fair and impartial they've been. So I just wanted to say that, Dilipji.
No, I think it's a great point. Again, it's from my side, it's the same thing. I have so many Jewish friends. I work together with them. It's a great faith. They have many great practices. So there is no intention over here to criticize any faith. We are just here today, happen to be talking about Hindu-Jewish marriage relationship, and that's why we'll be talking about. But there is no intention to defame any faith in any respect. So very good. We talk a lot more about interfaith marriages. Now, there have been talk about interfaith divorces and how that impact the religious upbringing of Hindu-American children. We talk how divorce is a sensitive topic, especially when our community and not many people come from and will come out and talk about it. So first of all, I applaud you for you coming out and speaking about such a difficult subject. So before we begin, can you tell us why should Hindu American community care about interfaith divorce and the impact about religious upbringing?
I would say if for no other reason, because it can affect your children and your grandchildren. As you know, when Hindus get married to one another, we generally don't think about divorce, even as a possibility. But we should all pay attention to the trends, at least, which indicate that the divorce rate in our community as well is going up. It's low for those raised in India, but it's higher among the next generation, people like myself, and even higher among the ones entering into interfaith marriages. The numbers are already big. 40% of Hindu Americans are now entering into interfaith marriages. Now, we don't know exactly what percent of those are ending in divorce, but 50% of all marriages in America end in divorce. And again, it's even higher for interfaith marriages. So in my opinion, there's no doubt this is already a problem, and it's going to only become a bigger problem. So you yourself might be married to another Hindu, but it's very possible your child or your grandchild will enter into an interfaith marriage. And then despite the best of intentions, it's very possible there'll be a divorce with young children involved. And the question of their religious upbringing will arise. So there's already a lot of talk about the challenges of passing on your religious and cultural values while in an interfaith marriage. But why doesn't anyone talk about the challenges of passing those on in interfaith divorce? That also, I would argue, is a big issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a very sensitive topic, and it's very important to discuss all those things before getting into, getting into marriage.
Yeah.
So the number of children coming from interfaith divorces could be quite large. How do the challenges of passing Hindu values compared in those situations?
I think they're much, much greater when the parents divorce, mainly because the parents may have had a commitment to interfaith upbringing before, but that commitment often just disappears after the divorce. Divorce is never easy, I could tell you. It's highly emotional, and the whole process often just creates more conflict. And there can already be tension while the parties of different religions are married, after they have kids, as you've written about. But when they're still married, each party at least has respect for the other party, their religion, and tries to make peace. They still have to live with each other. So once they divorce, any reason to compromise often goes out the window. In fact, what was once an interfaith commitment can become more of an interfaith competition, with each religion, trying to overshadow the other in terms of the child's upbringing. So I think the challenges become actually a lot greater. But there's another reason for the challenges, which is what I'm focusing on. We live in a country where local governments can effectively decide on the religious upbringing of the children. There's this whole family law system comprised of judges, mediators, and such who step in and decide these things when the parties disagree. Unfortunately, I would argue the system unintentionally generally favors the more established religions. Now, freedom of religion is very First Amendment in the Constitution. It's supposed to be protected even at the state level where this system operates. But you're talking about custody issues, children's activities, and most of the time, these local judges are given a lot of discretion to make decisions on such activities, including the religious ones, based all on what they deem to be in the quote unquote best interests of the child. Again, it's state by state, but best interests of the child is a major legal standard across states, basically trumps everything else, including religion. So if a judge determines based on the information the parties present, and more importantly, how that judge interprets that information, that it's in a child's best interest to engage in this religious activity and not that activity, they can actually order that.
So judges are not exposed to Hinduism, may not know Hindu or dharmic activities. And here they are discussing what is best interest of Hindu, Jewish, or Hindu Abrahamic, and that itself could be not the bias, but because they don't have a knowledge about Hindu systems, and that could be bringing a lot more conflicts or disadvantage to Hindu side. So how is this religious upbringing even relevant to quote unquote, as you said, best interests of children?
I started asking the same thing, and New Jersey actually has a Hindu American state senator. So I reached out to him and ended up talking to his office. They did some research, and evidently, because of how contentious many divorces can be, the feedback they got is that people often end up in confrontations that put the kids in the middle, and then the courts need to decide on that. Someone needs to. They gave me some examples. So perhaps there was a real decision, for example, to raise the children, say, Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a dispute on that, and the non-Catholic parent comes up with a quote-unquote religious activity, really just to spite the other parent. This can be disruptive to the child, given the child was actually being raised Catholic. In other cases, maybe the activities are totally legitimate, but there's a conflict in the timing, and the parents can't agree, or rather won't agree, as happens a lot in divorce. In that case, the judge needs to make some determination as well and decide which is more important for the kid, or can one activity be rescheduled somehow. So there is a role for judges to decide such things. But my big concern is next to none of the judges are Hindu Americans. The vast majority, almost all of them, appear to be of Judeo-Christian background. Even in the state where I live, which is New Jersey, where the state that has the highest percentage of Hindu Americans, probably 5% today, barely 1% of the judges are of Hindu American background, even now.
Do you think some of those judges are biased against Hindu American? That's what you are trying to say?
No. I actually think the vast majority of these judges are very well intentioned, genuinely believe in justice, and became judges because they want to serve society. And they're deciding cases where the situation is often contentious, with parties taking very different positions and perhaps twisting facts. So all of that also makes it difficult for any judge to know what's actually true. So my concern is not that judges are individually biased against Hindu Americans. And I'm sure there are many judges who are also knowledgeable about Hinduism and can rule quite competently in these matters. But I am concerned, based on everything I'm hearing, that there are too many judges still who lack the required knowledge about our religion and practices in the context of what are very often these sort of he said, she said type situations. Because that lack of knowledge ends up working against us, against Hindu Americans, it creates what one would call systemic bias. So it's not intentional, it's just the system creates these outcomes. There, I think people have to recognize our religion is very unique and very different from the Judeo-Christian religions, as you know. Our religion, it's much more flexible. There's no orthodoxy, there's no central authority. And as a result, there are many different ways to practice Hinduism. There are many different variants. My family came from Karnataka. They're Lingayats. It's a variant of Hinduism, practiced very differently than someone who comes from a different variant. So you can practice Hinduism any number of ways and still be a Hindu. Our religion also encourages seeking rather than believing. So you don't have to believe any particular thing and you could still be a Hindu. And our religion is inherently pluralistic, meaning there's no prohibition against engaging in other religions, traditions, or even praying to another god. Our religion actually encourages open-mindedness. So you can go pray. This is how I was raised. You could go pray in a church or a synagogue or whatever, and you're still a Hindu. There's nothing wrong with that. This is very different, at least historically, from the Judeo-Christian religions, which are more institutionalized with a defined set of beliefs and practices that you're supposed to follow. And historically, the injunction has been to be of that faith and no other, and therefore follow those beliefs and practice and no other. Praying to an idol, for example, has historically been considered sacrilegious. The final thing about our community that people don't understand, it's more related to our situation here, is that historically our religion has been very underrepresented in this country, not represented at all until the 60s. There are close to 400,000 churches in the US. In my town, every block seems to have a church, every 2 blocks. Yeah. And there are close to 4,000 synagogues. And these are often well-established institutions with full-time staff members and preschools attached. There's so many Christian and Jewish preschools that even non-Christians and non-Jews will put their kids in them. Sort of fill this need. You have public education from K to 12, but nothing for preschool. And they've been there all these centuries and they fill that gap. But our community certainly doesn't have that kind of infrastructure. I mean, only now do we have Hindu temples, and those are in certain pockets of the country, right? And with rare exceptions, they aren't well staffed. It's not, at least I haven't heard of any Hindu preschool, as an example.
Yeah.
We also don't have national or regional holidays tied to our religion. That I think makes it harder for family members to travel and celebrate our holidays together. But unfortunately, many judges, understandably, because of their backgrounds, lack of exposure, our being new and still small as a community, they just don't have enough knowledge about our religion. Again, it's understandable, but unfortunately, it leads to them interpreting the facts of a particular case from a very Judeo-Christian perspective on what those facts mean. And they often are unaware of the challenges we face, like not having the same infrastructure.
I'm glad you are open, sharing your knowledge. Hindu community has a lot to learn. Even American judges should learn a lot more how to be sensitive to the other communities, which they may not have much knowledge about it. So can you give examples of how this all played out based on what you have learned?
Yes, I think you and I both heard of situations where a judge has interpreted the fact that a child underwent a baptism or a bris as meaning the child was being raised in that faith and just that faith, even though the Hindu parent didn't mean for that to be the interpretation and just considered it as a ceremony. And then the court favored the other faith on that basis. There are situations where the judge may see that the family attended a church or a synagogue regularly, but not a Hindu temple. Never mind if there wasn't even a Hindu temple in the area, or, never mind if the Hindu just had a different way of practicing his faith, less familiar to a Judeo-Christian person. The judge might end up discounting the Hindu American's faith and then favoring the Judeo-Christian activities for the children. Even if it's clear the children are being raised interfaith, if there's a conflict in timing, a judge may favor Judeo-Christian activities over less familiar Hindu activities, like our spiritual practices, which they may not understand or view as secular or not view as having the same legitimacy or credibility. And oftentimes it may be a combination of these factors, left unsaid, perhaps. I believe something like that happened in my case, which I'll get to in a bit. But again, I want to say this isn't bias on the part of individual judges. It's more lack of knowledge. But unfortunately, this lack of knowledge appears to be widespread through this system, and it acts against us. The judges may be well-intentioned, but they're human beings, and you have many situations where judges who really don't know much about Hinduism and have busy caseloads, they're suddenly expected to make decisions about the religious upbringing of the children of Hindu Americans. And it doesn't appear there are any resources provided to the judges to help them with any such gap in their knowledge. One of my best friends, childhood friend I grew up with, Korean American in California, his wife is actually a judge. She confirmed even in California, there's no training provided to family law judges on various religious practices. And that's one of the most diverse states with tons of Hindu Americans, as you yourself know. Same thing for New Jersey. So I think it's obvious that this way of doing things is very flawed and is going to lead to bias. And this bias can affect any minority religion, but I think it especially works against Hindu Americans because of our religion, our unique characteristics. And, it could not only affect your children, but over time, it could have a huge impact on our community.
Yep. Now, I think probably Interfaith Shadi should prepare educational material for judges, educating about the Hindu practices or dharmic practices. So how widespread is the systemic bias, do you think? And why isn't it reported more?
So nobody can say for sure how widespread it is because there's just no data. There's no readily accessible way to get the data. Family law systems, again, it operates at the state level. So their systems are very much state by state. And while generally state court cases are public information, from what I've seen, the states don't keep, online databases of the cases. You have to specially request them. And the cases aren't indexed or organized, or categorized. So you don't know which pertain to what issue, like what case pertains to religious upbringing. It's not possible to tell by so-and-so versus so-and-so, the title of the cases. So it's basically impossible to tell in terms of data. In terms of anecdote, as you know, divorce is still a sensitive subject for most people, it's especially in our community, where it can still be a source of shame or at least embarrassment. I have a friend, been divorced for 7 years, raised in India. Her own relatives in India don't know that she's divorced. She goes there, they'll ask, how's your husband doing? And she'll say, he's fine, he couldn't make it. It's like that, right? So people don't like to come out and talk about their divorces. Unfortunately, that means we don't hear enough about these cases. But I personally think it's widespread for two reasons. As I've spoken to people, I've been amazed by how many people have a friend or a relative or heard of such and such person who's been similarly affected. Again, generally worse than I've been. And you and I have been counseling a couple women who might be in this situation shortly. So we have our own experiences to draw from. And plus, based on my experience going through my case, this seems to be common knowledge among these family law lawyers. My own lawyer told me before my case that it's commonly known that judges tend to favor activities that they themselves are familiar with, like a bricks and mortar religious school, versus a Hindu spiritual practice. He just said this matter of factly, like it's the norm and, everyone's accepted it. So I think that tells you this is just the prevailing order of things and people have just accepted it. But they shouldn't, in my view. I also think it's important to note most cases, probably 99%, don't go to trial. They're settled out of court because it's very costly for most people to litigate. But guess what? When they settle, how do people decide? They look at how these things are likely to be decided by a judge, and then they work backwards and settle on what on that basis. So when you're likely to lose, you end up settling for whatever you can get. This happens all the time. So I would argue any amount of systemic bias ought to be addressed because of these sort of second order effects.
Well, that's really helpful context. Now, let's get into your own situation. Probably that's the most people are interested in. And to set the stage, can you tell the interviewer, can you tell the reviewers what kind of upbringing that you had it, and starting with your birth as part of that, and about your religious beliefs and practices?
Sure. I was born in this country in Los Angeles in 1973, not to date myself. My parents immigrated from India. My father was an engineer, and my mother, she also worked, but mainly focused on raising us. I was very much raised as a Hindu, the Hindu upbringing. My mother is fairly religious. She was always doing puja and involving my brother and me. We also, as a family, went to Vedanta temple every Sunday. This was, an hour away in Hollywood. We lived in Los Angeles suburbs. Vedanta temple. This was run by the Ramakrishna Vivekananda mission.
Hmm.
And, after the Swamiji's talk, my mother would take me to the bookshop at the temple and get me an Amarchitra Katha comic. And
Wow.
I really look forward to those. That's one of my best memories as a child, was reading all of those. In fact, funny story, she recently found some of my old comic books. These are now, 40 plus years old, and sent them to me. I have some here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah, and my children loved. I got these for my children, the newer ones. They haven't changed. Really, nothing much has changed other than the price. These say 2.5 rupees. I think they're now 90 or 100,
Yeah.
$100. Um, but they saw them and they just rushed into the box and tried to grab it. And I found myself snatching them away, just saying, "Hey, hey, hey, those are my comics. Go
Yeah.
read your own comics." So that's how attached I was to these. Um, Anyhow, my parents had a lot of Indian friends, and we ended up going to a lot of Indian functions, Virashaiva Lingayat, how things are, very factionalized, but we also had North Indian friends and such. I was part of that. That was my home life. But we also lived in a very diverse neighborhood. At that time, there weren't so many Indians here. There were lots of whites, Hispanics, blacks, and different types of Asians, Southern California. And a lot of my good friends were Korean American, for instance, too. So I grew up with good friends of all backgrounds and religions. And also this Vedanta temple, you're probably familiar with Ramakrishna Vivekananda. The
Mm.
one I went to, it also taught us, in fact, I think it was written at the temple, something I always thought was just a beautiful quote that I continue to quote: just as all rivers lead to the same ocean, all paths lead to the same God. And that's one thing I really love about our religion, about Hinduism. It's inherently pluralistic. It's also not dogmatic. It encourages curiosity and asking questions. So because of that, my exposure, the way I was raised, I never thought that I shouldn't read about other religions or learn from them. And I've always been encouraged that way, to be curious, and to be curious about other religions even, and what answers they can provide to questions about life. So I basically grew up as a Hindu, but as a very open-minded Hindu, like most Hindus, in that vein of Swami Vivekananda, comfortable going to a church or whatnot and participating in other religious celebrations, like Christmas, which my family celebrated every year. It's important to me. In my early 20s, I learned a meditation called transcendental meditation, and that's been life-changing for me. I've practiced it literally every day, twice a
Mhm.
day, the vast majority of days, for 27 years now.
Mm.
This takes about 45 minutes a day, all told, every day, and I think that tells you how committed I am to it. Um, it's wonderful. I would recommend it to anyone. It's one, whether you're Hindu or not, that keeping with our
Yeah, yeah.
religion, pluralism. It's wonderful for your energy and your focus and your creativity. And I spend 45 minutes a day, but I feel I'm so much more productive even spending that much time when I meditate versus if I don't meditate.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, there's a great quote. I think Gandhiji said, you should meditate. I think he said 15 minutes a day. And if you don't have time, meditate an hour. So
Okay.
that's one I quote a lot too. Um, Anyhow, I think it's great for your productivity, but it's also, more importantly, I think it's very spiritual. And over time, the benefits accumulate and you start feeling a greater and greater sense of connection to something larger than yourself. In TM, Transcendental Meditation, they call it cosmic consciousness, eventually unity consciousness. And that brings a great sense of inner peace, which is exactly what our spiritual practices are, like meditation, are supposed to do, right? That is our religion. So meditation is obviously hugely significant, came from our religion. TM, Transcendental Meditation, is one such technique. And it
Mm.
was brought by a fellow named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to the US and made popular back in the 60s and 70s when he taught the Beatles.
Yeah.
Now, he gave it his own brand, but it's really an ancient Vedic technique, obviously of Hindu origin. And other Hindu organizations also have their own versions of the technique. They call it something else, their own branding, like the Art of Living Foundation. They have this technique, next to their pranayama technique. So I would say this Vedic meditation has been the most important way I've personally practiced Hinduism my adult life, certainly in my 20s and 30s when I was otherwise focused on my life, career, whatnot. And it's still hugely important, through my 40s and now in my early 50s. but now having and raising kids, I've also come full circle to my childhood roots in Vedanta. I take my kids on my weekends to Balvihar, which is run by the Chinmaya Mission.
Wow.
It's an hour away from where I live in New York City.
Mhm.
I live in New Jersey. I have to drive to New York City, but it's well worth the drive.
Mhm.
While the children do their classes on, Krishna or Hanuman, the adults have a satsang where we read from Vedic texts, and
Wow.
the brahmacharya leads a discussion about the texts and how they apply to life. And you come out lighter. It's really a terrific program, I think, for the whole family. And, the kids like it, and I really like it. So, yeah, that's my upbringing and how I practice my faith today.
Seems like if I summarize your upbringing, it's in a way it's a very typical upbringing that Hindu parents really, work very hard to try to install Hindu religious some practices, some exposures, not too much. We don't have too many dogmas and all that. And also always pluralistic. There is nothing against other faith. They can practice their own ways, and like you said, all the rivers meet in the same ocean. So probably when now you're grown up and looking for a girl, I guess. Did you have the concept that I'm going to marry only Hindu girl?
No, 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 not at all. I grew up with, in school where you tend to meet people
Uh-huh.
like that. It was mostly not Indians, and so I dated both. I dated Indians, uh, dated non-Indians as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've never had that sort of thing. I've always felt it just as a matter of principle to treat people equally.
Yep.
So I was never clannish. I had Indian friends. Obviously, you can relate to people of your own background, but I was never that sort of
Yep.
clannish person.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned, some of my best friends are Korean American. I know quite a bit about that culture
Yeah.
as a result. So, so not at all.
Good. So we saw your background. Now let's move to the next stage. Now saw this girl. Let's call her not the real name, but let's call her Rachel,
Okay.
a Jewish lady. Uh, Tell her how you met her and how you reached to the stage of engagement, and then we'll discuss the other part later on. Yeah.
Sure, sure. So I was raised. My parents were Indian immigrants. So I was raised Hindu, had an Indian identity as well as my American identity. I used to visit India as a child, and I always wanted to go back. And then I had the opportunity to travel for a couple months, spent some time in India as an adult for the first time. With some money, and just going as a child is a very different experience. And I was with a friend of mine from college who had moved back to India and hanging out in Bombay, and really was excited by what I saw, and I wanted to move there. And I figured I could get an international experience in a country that I always had some warmth towards, but I'd never really lived there as an adult. Just a lot of visits as a child. So I ended up moving to India and spent most of my 30s there. I lived in India
Wow.
for 7 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Um, and I met my now ex-wife while I was living there via some mutual friends. I was working in finance. She was a freelance journalist. She was there for a couple years only. But we met. I had moved to India from New York, and then ended up meeting her, a Jewish girl from New York,
Wow.
ironically, and we started dating, and then fell in love, and we ended up moving back to the U.S. together less than a year later. We lived together in the U.S. and then quickly got engaged and then married. It was all pretty quick. We basically got married about 2 years after we started dating. But we at that time we were happy. It felt right. We're also both a bit older. I was in my late 30s. She was in her early 30s. We both knew we would want kids, so it felt right. It just seemed to make sense to get married and not waste too much time. So
Hmm.
that's how that happened.
Wow. So you met a Jewish lady. You are American. Both are American, and you met in India.
Yeah.
And naturally, being American in India, that's one connections. And both are probably professionals, and that's also ties together. So I guess you fall in love. So wonderful. So again, just when people fall in love, I mean, it's rah-rah, so much fun, so much excitement, so much adrenaline, sex hormones running in your blood. And so was there any discussions? You're Hindu, she's Jewish. Was there any discussions about religion during those times?
Yes, yes. I mean, she had her Jewish identity, and even while we were dating, she asked if things worked out and we had children, would I be comfortable with raising those children Jewish? And, you know, I've always had a lot of Jewish friends in college as well as afterwards. I had a Jewish roommate 1 year in college, and I had three different Jewish roommates afterwards when I was a young man in New York, you know, sharing
Mhm.
apartments with people. So some of my best friends have been Jewish, even today. And in fact, my mentor growing up was actually Jewish, believe it or not. This was my Uncle Paul, as I call him. He wasn't my blood uncle. His full name was Paul Levine, Dr. Paul Levine.
Mhm.
But he was a close family friend that I knew from, I think, birth, as far back as I can remember. He was very good friends with my parents. He was a brilliant man, a physicist who became a highly successful tech entrepreneur. He went to MIT and then got his PhD from Caltech. He didn't have children of his own, and he and I became very, very close. He even, my family went through some tough times when I was going in college. Just father lost his job, defense industry cutbacks in California. So my Uncle Paul actually helped me financially
Wow. Mm,
in college. And I mean, I really did consider him my uncle. And
mm,
he unfortunately is no longer with us.
mm.
But when he informed me that he was dying from cancer, he entitled the email
Wow.
to my favorite nephew, and he had other nephews, blood nephews. So we were very, very close.
Mm.
And, he was also incredibly spiritual. He
Ah,
actually believed in reincarnation, did past life regression and things like that. A scientist, right? Um, but very spiritual. And he was actually the one who got me into transcendental meditation, believe it or not. He
hmm.
was into it himself. They would come visit, stay at our house, and I grew up overhearing, at that, I think it was Channel 18. They would watch the Maharishi speaking.
Oh, wow.
He
Mm,
knew the Maharishi personally, and he actually did the original brainwave studies for the organization, which got published in Scientific American.
mm.
Uh, so yeah, so I had such incredible respect for him that when he suggested I try it right after college, I signed up right away, and it worked for me, and that's changed my life more than anything. So I'm saying all this because I just want to make the point, give you my background. I've always had a great love for Jewish people and their culture.
Mm.
Uh, and I told you about my upbringing and how I was very open-minded, finding wisdom in all religions. So I was fine, as I told her, with any future children having a Jewish upbringing. Uh, but at the same time, I valued my own upbringing and the wisdom in Hinduism and our spiritual practices like meditation. So I told my now ex-wife that I would be happy for, of course, for any future kids to be raised Jewish, but so long as they could also be raised Hindu. I also made it clear that I identified as a Hindu and that while I would love to learn more about her religion and celebrate her holidays and ceremonies and whatnot, I was quite happy with my religion, and she should never have any expectation that I would convert. I was very clear on that.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah, and I never even considered it or anything. I was very clear on that up front, and she understood, and I believe she agreed to all that.
Uh, it's a that's a typical. I have seen that when the Abrahamic says that can we raise children in my faith, uh, and Hindu says how about my faith too. So I mean that looks good on paper or on upfront, but many times people, and that's I have covered in my book extensively, that they don't realize that when you say that's raise children in my faith, meaning it's just so much commitment. For example, you may have faced the bar mitzvahs, going to be baptized, meaning going to church and so many hours sitting in the church bench and all that, which just Hindu will, or in Islam. And when you go to, let's say, in Islam case, you go sitting in the madrasa having educations, and when they say counter educations against Hindu beliefs, like Hindu maybe idol worshipper, polytheists, believing in other gods. So it creates really a lot of conflicts, which dating Hindu or dating Abrahamic cannot realize what does it mean raising children in two faiths. So did you get into specific how would you raise your interfaith children?
Yeah. So we did none of that. I mean, in retrospect, that was probably a mistake, but no, we
Yeah.
didn't. We never got into exactly what these activities would look like what her religion, what she had in mind, what that would look like, what my activities would look like, how we would
Right,
manage any scheduling conflicts. We never got into any of that.
right, right, right.
I mean, we had some idea of how we each practiced our religion, but as adults, so I joined her in celebrating Jewish holidays with her family. You know, at that time, it wasn't like she was going to a synagogue regularly or I was going to a temple regularly. We were kind of doing our thing, and for her, it was celebrating the Jewish holidays with her family, and for me, it was doing my meditation practice twice a day, every day. But we never got into kids' activities, at least not in any detail. I mean, I she knew my meditation was very important to me and that I'd want my kids to learn it. And she knew I grew up going to a Vedanta temple, learning about the Hindu stories, the epics, and that I would want my children to be able to do those things too, while still making room for her religious activities. And I knew she would probably want the children to have a bar mitzvah. They talked about bar mitzvahs in her family, nieces, nephews, cousins, that sort of thing, going through those. For women, it's called a bat mitzvah. These are pretty common Jewish ceremonies, initiation ceremonies, technically. But we didn't discuss how much, preparation there would be for that and what form and how we would balance any different religious activities. So I think it was very broad brush. I think we just assumed we would figure it out. But unfortunately, that left us in a situation where there was a lot of room for disagreement after we separated. I think everyone's recollection and interpretation of something you agreed on years before but when it's just verbal, can always vary for whatever reason. But by not thinking things through in detail and then writing them down, we contributed to a situation where there was going to be conflict. And I'll own it too. This was as much my fault as hers. So I want to be fair. And I also want to be fair, to both parties, that everything I'm talking about here is my recollection. I do want to add, it's relevant as we talk about my case, that my ex-wife's position in our court case was very different from mine. It was that we agreed to raise the kids Jewish, Jewish period, or Jewish with just some exposure to Hindu traditions based on how you interpret her various statements. She said, we discussed and agreed upon this. So we had very different views on what we actually agreed. But again, there was no formal written agreement on this. We were left with whatever evidence we could each present.
I think it's this is the point I'm working on it all along. That Hindu being so open-minded, they keep on saying, yes, yes, I can do bar mitzvah, I can do these things, you go and visit the synagogue. Probably you may have spent probably 90% of time in synagogue or Jewish activities versus hardly 5 or 10% time in Hindu mandirs. And what percentage of time you spend in Jewish activity versus time you spend in Hindu mandirs or Hindu activities?
Well, I think before we got married, it was similar because she wasn't going to a synagogue regularly. Now we were in India, the first part of our relationship. There actually are synagogues there. I think she may have visited one out of curiosity. It was a different situation there. And then you come to the US and it's the inverse situation where there's, in my town, there's like 4 different synagogues or something and no Hindu temples, right? So, but even before we had kids, she wasn't going to, I would say it's about equal. She had her religious holidays. Her family's all here in the New York City, greater New York area. Mine isn't. So they would celebrate the high holidays, as they call them, together.
Yeah.
I was doing my Vedic meditation once in a while with a Hindu friend, go to a temple or something, or go to a Diwali party, but not, we were, I would say, equal. When we had kids, it changed, and we could discuss that.
I think that's another important point, that religion is not something very consistent throughout your life. And at age 20, probably you are the least religious. You don't care about religious. You are an atheist, whatever you want to call it. But sure, I tell people that at age 45, all of a sudden, you don't know, then you become religious. In my own case, my mother was very religious, and she says, you should read this book and these things, and you should do these things, and you should do puja. And when I published my first book and gave it to her, and she was surprised. Wow, You wrote a book on religion. You did not even care for religion. You did not, I mean, she thought I'm an atheist. So when you are dating, or what I recommend all of those youths, that whatever discussion you have, make sure you keep all the options open, even though you are an atheist. Doesn't matter. Keep your options open. That who knows, you may become religious one day. So don't commit to your spouse religion too much for it. And in my book, I said no BBS. There is a good description. That is the baptism, bris, and Sahadat Sunan. Meaning no commitment, keep everything open, so other party does not get into any wrong impression. You don't get into wrong impression. So did you ever discuss what would you do in case of divorce? I don't think anybody much discussed, but did you ever discuss that, what we will do in such situation?
Yeah, no, no. And I just want to back up. I know, we've discussed this, no BBS. I totally respect your view. I might have a slightly different view there. I would hope that you could agree. So agree on equal priority, equal equality of the two religions so that you both can celebrate each other's festivities. Because nowadays oftentimes they're just an excuse for a party, really, right? Like some of these ceremonies for some people, for other people, they may be more initiation. But I think if you kind of define that and define equality up front, then maybe you can hopefully both have these family events, right? So that I might differ a little bit, but I think we're not dramatically different there. And I think,
But on that point, what I'm saying is promise less, produce more. So when you're dating, if somebody party says, I need to have these things indirectly, outright said no. But then when you get into actual love, once you get married and having reason, produce more than what you promise.
yeah,
Because
I
if you
would,
promise
I would,
more, you get into legal trouble, like you are probably you are facing. So
yeah,
don't promise anything, but then ultimately you end up celebrating a lot more than, and this is, wow, I never expected. I thought you will not accept my faith, but then you end up celebrating every day. So I'm exactly agreeing what you are saying. Only
yeah,
thing I'm saying is that don't get trapped into
yeah.
giving wrong impression that you're going to follow the faith. That's my point.
Yeah, I agree. That makes complete sense. You have to bake it into the equation that both parties are going to feel uh, that passing on their traditions becomes more important once you actually have the kid, right?
Yeah.
So I would agree with that. But yeah, coming back to your question, no, we never even discussed divorce, let alone what we would do after divorce. So I think, uh, like a lot of people, we're going into it with a positive mindset. It was my first marriage, certainly, and I think we assumed that our marriage would be a success. So everything we discussed, which I've relayed, all verbal, kind of broad brush, even that was in the context of being married, staying married. So there were no terms or conditions ever discussed, which again contributed to a situation where there was going to be conflict after.
On that point, I mean, I'm really, I don't know how people says you must have a prenuptial agreement. But again, when you are in love, you feel that this is going to be my life. How could you start putting numbers and dollars and cents and be so dry? And but again, a lot of people recommend that definitely have prenuptial agreements.
It logically makes sense. The problem is you're not in a logical state of mind
Yeah.
when you go through this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we saw your childhood, we saw how you met. Now tell us about your wedding and your married life.
Sure.
Till Rachel was pregnant with the first son. So your newly married couple, how was your life?
Yeah, so I'll make it quick. We had just a really small, really simple wedding. It was a civil ceremony, but we added both Jewish and Hindu touches, to the actual wedding. So, for example, Jews typically get married under something that's called a huppah,
Yeah,
and it looks a lot like a Hindu mandap. So
yeah,
we created a combo huppah mandap. We added jasmine flowers to make it look more Indian. There was the Jewish breaking of the glass. The bride will
yeah.
stomp on a glass.
And we have coconuts.
We do, yeah, we have coconuts. We didn't do that, but what we did do was the exchanging of the garlands underneath
Yeah.
the opamanda. We danced the hora, which is a traditional Jewish dance, but we had Indian food catered for the reception. So like that, there were touches from both faiths. But there was no rabbi marrying us. There was no Hindu priest for that matter. It was a secular wedding, but also I would argue interfaith because of how we, how we did it, how we dressed it up. In terms of married life, again, we were pretty happy before the marriage, and we were pretty happy after. But we didn't have that long of a honeymoon period because she got pregnant several months later.
Mm.
As I mentioned, we were both not the youngest and wanted to have kids, so we started trying right after. And then we were just consumed with planning for that first kid, then having the kids. We had two in rapid succession. So yeah, that's those were the early days of the marriage.
Wow. So I see that you both were secular, open-minded. Everything was you were accepting. You met in India, so everything was looks. Everything is going good so far. Religion is concerned. Now tell us about your kids. What were their names and how you raised them till you got divorced?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had two boys, two kids. They're both boys in rapid succession, 2 years apart,
Mhm.
which was great. And I credit my ex-wife for that. She, had a plan there, and I'm glad I went along with it, and it was great. It's a blessing. Is a blessing. So both of them are great kids, healthy and happy. Hope it stays that way. We ended up giving our eldest son a biblical first name, Isaac,
Mhm.
but his middle name is a Hindu name, Shyam, as in Lord
Mhm.
Krishna. And then we did the opposite with our second boy. His first name is a Hindu name, Arav, another
Mhm.
name for Lord Shiva, and also means peaceful in Sanskrit. And his middle name is Levi, a strong Jewish name. So we did this mixy matchy thing because we were interfaith, and the names being alternated between kids. To me, that was in honor of both faiths being of equal importance. Uh, I say to me because that was my understanding, and again, I want to acknowledge, in fairness, that the other party took a different position. Uh, in terms of how we raised them, again, we ended up separating when they were just 4 and 2. Uh, just, they were too young for any religious schooling. But I always believed we were raising the kids interfaith. We both read books to them about both Hinduism and Judaism, with both of us reading both types of books, uh, learning each other's mythology or whatnot. We both told them that they were both Jewish and Hindu, and we actually referred ourselves in writing as an interfaith family, as well as a Jewish Hindu family, or Hindu for short. It's kind of a
Mhm.
cute portmanteau. Uh, I will note a few things, however, that came up in our court case, just in fairness, uh, and to give readers context, to give everyone context. First, we put our kids into a Jewish preschool. Now, we happened to live a couple blocks away from it, a 5-minute walk, and we had a nanny who didn't drive. So in my opinion, that's the main reason we enrolled our first child there. We evaluated a number of other preschools before we locked on this one, including a secular one, like a Montessori one. And before then, we had our eldest child, when he was our only child at that time, in a YMCA for daycare. And YMCA, I would note, is of Christian origin. So, but we did then decide on a Jewish preschool. Many of the kids at that preschool were of other religions or from interfaith families.
Mhm.
Uh, again, it's not uncommon for people to, non-Christians, non-Jews, to put their kid in a Christian
Mhm.
or Jewish preschool because of the availability. And as a Hindu, there's nothing in our religion prohibiting that, of course. But we did enroll them there. And when we enrolled our second child, we also joined the synagogue that hosted it. As
Mhm.
members, we got a discount on the preschool, and with two kids, there basically was no real incremental
Mhm.
cost. And again, I was raised extremely open-minded. I was also thinking of us as a team, and I thought it would be nice for my wife at the time, as well as the kids, to have that community in a very nice facility, just a 5-minute walk away from our house.
Mhm.
Uh, Again, there's nothing in our religion that prohibits this, and as far as I was concerned, it didn't change our commitment to being interfaith. In fact, there was an interfaith group within the synagogue comprising families like ours, which we joined. Uh, the other thing I would note is that this also kind of came up, is my ex-wife comes from a very large Jewish family, all in driving distance of where we live, greater New York City area.
Mhm.
Uh, I have a very small family. Most of my relatives still live in India. It was just my father and my mother who immigrated here, and their father's long deceased, but my mom and my other, my brother and his two sons, they all that's my family here. They all live on the other side of the country in California. So of course we ended up seeing my Jewish ex-wife's family a lot more, and a lot of those get-togethers centered around the Jewish holidays, the high holidays when they all could take time off from work or school. Uh, and again, I was happy to participate in her religious holidays, occasions, and just didn't see any conflict with my religion or with our commitment to an interfaith upbringing. And again, there was simply no Hindu temple in our town or the neighboring towns. If there had been, I'm certain we would have taken the kids there, at least, we would have taken them there at least occasionally. And meditation was my main form of spiritual connection, but the kids were too young to meditate. They were just 4 and 2 when we separated. So again, we mainly read them books on the Hindu gods and epics. And when my mom visited, we did puja. I taught them some yoga as well. But I wasn't concerned about any of this because I thought there was a commitment to an interfaith upbringing, and that I would get the kids more into Hindu activities as they got older, and as the activities that I gravitated towards, like meditation, Vedanta temple, which can be a little intellectual, as those became more age appropriate. But I do want to point out all these facts because they do play into the dispute we later had. And it's important to understand that, to assess the systemic bias that, is the whole reason I'm here. In my ex-wife's view, I think it's safe to say these facts supported her position, that we had agreed the kids would be raised Jewish. Again, that was her position. Anyone's free to agree with one side or the other. I'm not getting into who's right or who's wrong. And all these things were certainly raised in court, which I would say any Hindu American entering into an interfaith marriage, the people that you're counseling, should at least be mindful of as a possible scenario.
So you thought you are an interfaith, both the but she thought that it's more a Jewish. The children will be raised in Jewish faith. Is it true?
That was the position she took, and yeah, my recollection is as you said.
See, that's the point I'm trying to make when I say this BBS. What I showed you in my book, that Hinduism is a pluralistic faith. The Abrahamics are exclusivist religion, meaning there is one God. That also means the second commandment says that do not pray to the other God. And some people interpreted it as these idol worshippers and not to follow them. So their BBS ritual, that is a baptism, bris, sahadat, sunat, is to make sure that the children that children belongs to that particular faith and not to other faiths. And that creates the conflicts. In terms of Hindu-Christian marriages, I have seen that when you have a wedding in the church, the Christian church makes you sign a prenuptial agreement that the children will be raised only in the Catholic faith, baptized and raised in Catholic faith. Jewish wants this bar mitzvah, bris bar mitzvah. And once you have a bris bar mitzvah, they consider just like probably your wife may have interpreted that, yes, you agree to bar mitzvah, meaning those children will be Jewish, meaning not Hindu in a way. So that's where the exclusivist mindset sets that where they belongs to. And in general, and again, if I continue on Islam, it's the same thing that they want for marriage. They want, before Islamic nikah wedding, they want the sahadat, religious conversion. And Hindu says, how does it matter? I'm whatever I am, so I don't mind. And they go through this sahadat ritual, meaning it just takes 1 minute saying something and they become Muslim. But that has a lot more legal implications later on. And because of all those confusions with this BBS exclusivity, and that's why I'm saying that if you outright says, nope, there will not be any BBS, give it in writing, so far legal point of concerns. Once you get married, definitely go and respect them as much you like it. So yeah, So major problem in interfaith marriages is one party is exclusivist minded, other is a pluralist. So that is the perfect match. But once you get into relationship, the exclusivist think that, well, you agreed to raise children in Jewish faith, and now you change it. So do you agree that the risk of interfaith marriage with someone with the Abrahamic, there is the inherent problems?
Well, I would say it really depends on the other person and their beliefs. And I want to be really sensitive here because I do have so many really wonderful friends of different faiths, including Jewish, Christian, Muslim. And I think all these ancient religions, including Hinduism, had their, evolved under their own historical influences and developed their own historical traditions. And some of those, are now considered obsolete. And, by most of the people who practice those faiths, or many of the people. And some of them are still the prevailing norm, and some that are in between, right? So I would also say, I think, as someone raised in the tradition of Swami Vivekananda, I think there's also wisdom in every religion. So I want to be careful that nothing I say comes across as saying that any one religion is better than another. That's not what I believe. As much as I value my own religion, of course. But I would say you're right. I think even someone who follows those religions has to acknowledge that, at least historically, one historical tradition of these Abrahamic religions, as you call it, is they are exclusive. Historically, at least, you're not supposed to engage in other religions' practices, and that's something that's still the norm for many of those followers today. Now, I have friends from these faiths who have chosen to live pluralistically.
Yeah.
They're genuinely willing to be in an interfaith marriage with interfaith children. And I have friends from these faiths who continue to follow their religion's more exclusivist traditions, and that's totally fine as far as I'm concerned. I mean, one of my best friends, a Korean American friend, he's a evangelical Christian, for example. His father's a pastor. He was just raised very traditionally, and he's one of my closest friends, and I respect his beliefs. In his case, he married another Christian so that there'd be no conflict in how they raised the children. With some of my Jewish friends, if they didn't marry another Jew, if they were marrying a non-Jew, it was so important that they insisted that their partner convert to their religion and raise any future children in their faith only. And I think that's fine. I think if it's really that important for you, for your children to be raised in your faith and your faith only, those are the best ways to do it. Either marry someone who's already your faith, or insist your partner convert to it and then raise the kids in that faith, right? But unfortunately, I think there are people who will agree to interfaith despite really wanting their children to be in their faith only, because they're in love, or perhaps, like we were talking earlier, they don't realize how much more important passing on their traditions, including their faith, will become once they have kids. And look, I think that's universal. I think that applies to people of all religions, including Hindus, right?
Yep.
But I mean, I've never heard of a Hindu requiring the partner to convert to Hinduism. That just doesn't happen. I think that's part and parcel of our pluralistic philosophy. But certainly there are Hindus who want their children to be fully of their culture, even subcultures, Gujaratis marrying Gujaratis, Punjabis marrying, that sort of thing. So, or maybe they just don't want any conflict, right? So they generally marry their own kind, right? That's what we see when it comes to Hindu Americans or Hindus. But I would say when it comes to interfaith marriages where the parties divorce and then there's a conflict over religious upbringing, I think in practice there is more of a risk for Hindu Americans. And that's really because of the combination of these factors. First, our unique pluralistic beliefs, which are just woven throughout our mindset. Second, our historical underrepresentation, which creates challenges like lack of infrastructure, that sort of thing. And then third, this again, systemic bias stemming from the fact that many of the judges, if not most of the judges, aren't knowledgeable enough about our beliefs and perhaps don't appreciate or even factor in our challenges.
Okay. Let's switch little gear. Let me go back to my book. Ask you some questions. I wish you read these question answers, and let's see how it fits in your situation. Let me read it and you try to answer it. FAQ. geodharmic marriage. These are the what I recommended. Do you have to sign a ketubia prenuptial agreement?
Oh, ketubah. We did mutually sign a ketubah, but it was an interfaith ketubah with the language all about respecting each other's differences, finding richness in those differences. We specifically had that language put in interfaith. There was nothing in there about being Jewish, raising the kids Jewish, or any of the commandments for that matter. It was not a prenup in any way. The way we discussed it, it was really something we were going to do so that we had some, ceremonial artwork for us to frame and hang in memory of our marriage, our interfaith marriage.
Okay. Just for viewers, ketubia is a Jewish marriage contract. But again, there are flexibilities what wording you put it on. So apparently, Raj Kachubia wordings are a lot more not committing, but more open. Yeah. Okay. Second question is, do your sons have to have religious bris circumcision? And just a reminder, as I put it in here, that circumcision is an irreversible procedure. You cannot undo it. Well, you can, but it's irreversible possible.
You can
And
undo
again,
anything nowadays.
it is it is done without child's consent. And I'm a scientist, and I would say that there is no compelling scientific merit to circumcision. So yeah, on the bris circumcision, can you shed more light on it? What you agreed and what you did?
I'm not sure you want me to shed more light on this, but so this might be too much information, but when I was growing up, pretty much all American males were circumcised, regardless of religion. That was the prevailing medical opinion at that time. And so that happened to me without my consent, but it happened to me. And as a result, I wanted my kids to be circumcised, my sons, because it wasn't a religious thing. It was just I felt it would be nice for them to match their father. So again, TMI. But anyhow, my point is I was fine. We did go through a bris. I was fine with having a ceremony made out of it, for my ex-wife and her family. So we did have a bris for each child at our home where we had her family over, catered food for the occasion, made a little party out of it, a get together. But it was important to me that we kept the sanctity of being interfaith. So when we looked for the mole is the Jewish term for the person who actually does the circumcision. We specifically looked for and hired someone who had done brises for interfaith families. Yeah, to answer your question.
Yeah. Do you children have to have a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah label? Did you agree that children will have bar mitzvah? Apparently, you said yes.
No, well, I think I expected it. I don't remember if we specifically discussed it, but I always expected that she would want that, probably want that. By the time it was of relevance. She had family members. Many of her family members were in interfaith. Some of them were in interfaith marriages, but I recall that she had family members, cousins or nieces and nephews, that sort of thing, going through that. And we went to some of those parties, and I was fine if we did that because there was an interfaith commitment. And my assumption was that, like a bris, this wouldn't signify a change in that interfaith upbringing. But again, they were only 4 and 2. We obviously parted ways long before any discussion of this.
Yeah, yeah. The other point is the name is significant and it reflects the traditions and cultures the parents are proud of and would like to have child follow. Are your children going to have a dharmic or Jewish names? I guess you already reflected somewhat on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess your question, this Q&A is for people at the beginning stages.
Yeah.
So we covered that. I think, our kids, again, they have both. The eldest, his name is Isaac Sham, and Sham being Krishna, and our youngest is Arav Levi, Arav being, Shiv.
Yeah. Good. Do you have to live within the driving distance from a synagogue so your children can attend the Jewish daycare and family can celebrate benefits from Jewish education? And at the same way, are you planning to do the equal time and effort for Hindu festivals and activities? So that's
Yeah,
a question. Basically, I asked the dating couple to think through, and so
yeah, it's good to ask those questions and think. We did not so much. I would say where we ended up living was really by accident. So we met in India. We moved back to the US. We were in Boston briefly and then New York City. And we lived in Brooklyn. And then when she was pregnant, we were looking for more space. A lot of people moved to the suburbs. So we looked at, we thought about two or three nearby suburbs. My ex is working in the city. So we needed train connectivity. We moved to a suburb that a lot of people from Brooklyn were moving to out here in New Jersey. It was more by accident. Um, I would say due to the way I was raised, I was open to a Jewish preschool and even joining a synagogue because inherently pluralistic. So we ended up doing all that, in my view, initially due to the convenience factor, as I explained, but then also for my ex-wife's, her own satisfaction. But this was all in the context of having a commitment to raising the children interfaith, in my opinion, and Hindu Americans also not having that kind of infrastructure, at least where we lived.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The other thing is, many times people say Burmese, yeah, sure, no problem. I mean, the Hindu may think at the dating time that, yeah, it's maybe few hours of some ceremony, just go there, some puja here, there, and you're done. But Burmese is a lot more, now you know it, it's a lot more committing. Uh, and that Lisa Miller in Newsweek article in 2010, she wrote it that the cost of being a Jewish could be very high, as high as $110,000 a year. Again, in circumstances, she may have put it in there. So do you realize the financial commitment, time commitments, and are you planning to do the same for Hindu activities? That's a question I ask during dating period. What you have to say, think of now.
Yeah. So I was never aware of that cost. I wonder if that is that upper end is really for people putting their kid into a full-time Jewish school, like a private school, instead of public school. So, but we never discussed any of this at any point. Our custody agreement specifically says we will put the kids in the public school system. Uh, that was always our assumption. Didn't even discuss that. It was just sort of taken as a given. In our child support agreement, we have a provision that each party is responsible for the cost of their religious activities on their time. So, I never saw this as an issue for us.
And the last question, and it's always a very difficult question. And in case if one of your child dates in your family, will he or she be given a Jewish burial or a Hindu cremation final rites? And note, you cannot have both ways. Either you are cremated or you have a burial, one or other ceremony. I mean, I know it is really, when you are dating, it's really hard to think all those things, but I'm just bringing couple what the reality of real life is. You may end up getting in this situation. You cannot fight after when something bad happens in life. You have to decide all those things upfront before, hopefully to avoid conflicts. So what do you want to say about it?
I honestly never thought about that. And, we certainly never discussed it. Yeah. It's even now, it's not something I
Yeah.
think I'll
But
spend
you realize that this could be a potential conflict issue comes up uh, when it's a really so sad period for both of you. But on top of it, you will have to decide that which way your son or daughter will go. I'm just, I mean, as a consultant, my job is not to make your life difficult, but just make them aware that there are a lot more complexities in married life. And it's better you think through all those beforehand, hopefully to avoid problems later on. So good enough about it. Let's move back to your situation. Now, we saw that, yeah, you were sort of open-minded both ways. So where did the problems start resurfacing between you two, leading to the decision of divorce? And was the religion involved?
Yeah. So, again, I want to be respectful to all parties. So, I don't really want to get into any
Yeah.
detail on marital issues, but I will say, they were definitely not about religion, so not really relevant to what we're discussing here.
I see.
We just had normal issues, things pretty common between busy working couples with young kids. Uh, I never, from my own perspective, I never imagined I would be divorced. It's not
And
something Hindus really think about or consider. But you have to take what life gives you and make the best of it. And even though it was very painful at the time, I came to realize it was for the best, and I continue to think that.
I know it is definitely very painful. Somebody you love so much dearly, and now you have to go through these difficult situations. And unfortunately, it's childrens are the one who will be most suffering along with you. So, can you speak of your child custody arrangement and how you arrived to that?
Yeah. So I won't get into all the details, but
Mm,
you know, we were fortunate. The kids were very young, only 4 and 2, when we separated. At that age, they don't really understand what divorce means. They can obviously feel your tension, but I think we did a good job of not arguing in front of them and shielding them from whatever was going on. So we were very lucky that way. In terms of custody, I know that even today, a lot of mothers end up doing most, if not all, the child rearing. Uh,
mhm.
but in my case, I was actually very involved, extremely involved, starting when they were babies, changing diapers, doing nighttime bottle feedings, reading to them at night. And then, as they got a little older, getting very physical with them, 2 young boys, horsey rides every day, wrestling with them, making them laugh. So I was extremely bonded with the kids, as my ex-wife was too, of course. Um, so it took several months living together while we sorted things out. We had different views, but we fortunately ended up agreeing, not having to litigate on joint legal custody with 50-50 parenting time. And then we were finally able to start living separately. Uh, when we finally told the kids the news, we did all the things you're supposed to, telling them that parents love them, etc. This will be better for them. And, we did a lot more frequent handoffs. So again, the kids were, fortunately, the most important thing is the kids were okay. I think all those things helped. Um, yeah, and I think it's turned out well for the kids versus the alternative of living with unhappy parents. So yeah, hopefully that addresses your question. And
Yeah, yeah. No, I know I can see that both of you are committed parents, both are professionals. You care for your children, and I'm sure you did your best to uh, have the least painful situation for your children. But yeah, it is definitely a very painful situation for everyone. So, can you tell us what you decided in terms of religious upbringing in your agreement, and how you and your ex-wife have done things in practice?
so our custody agreement, again, they were only 4 and 2. It didn't specify religious upbringing.
Mhm.
It does explicitly grant me the Hindu holidays, and it gives my ex the Jewish holidays. But there's nothing else in there about religion, nothing about Hebrew school or Hindu school. But they were 4 and 2. They weren't going through any formal religious schooling or anything. It was so that religious upbringing wasn't an issue during our marriage, or even when we were resolving child custody. The issues began shortly after. And again, I don't want to get, I'm comfortable talking about my own personal life growing up.
Yeah, I understand.
I don't
Totally
want to get
understand.
into much detail on these more sensitive subjects, but
Actually, I must thank you that you are being so much open, which versus others will not want to go on live with these things. So we fully respect you. So only disclose what you feel comfortable. Yes.
yeah, no, thank you. Just because it's important for us, but as I mentioned, we ended up having different positions on what we had agreed upon, and not having, a written agreement with terms and conditions, that didn't help. So it became pretty clear after we finalized custody and went our separate paths that we weren't going to agree on religious upbringing, which became an issue at that point. So we basically went our separate ways on religious activities. So until this latest dispute, my ex-wife was taking the kids to her religious activities on her days, and I was taking them to my religious activities on my days. I was generally just weekends. Uh, Personally, I have the utmost respect for my kids' Jewish heritage. I tell them even now they're both religions, and when they're old enough, it will be up to them what they want to do. They could continue being
Good.
both. They could be one or the other if they want to choose, or be something else,
Yeah,
still
yeah,
gonna love them, of course.
yeah.
And I honestly do find wisdom in all religions. So I even quote to them. I have a lot of quotes. Some of them are from the Bible, Old Testament, Torah. So Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, like those speak to me. So I'm fine with their getting educated in Judaism. I just want to make sure they get equally educated in our faith, in Hinduism. Uh, and eventually they'll make their own decisions, right? We can't control, none of us can control that ultimately.
Mhm. So what happened after you filed the motion?
Well, you mean like well let me back up. Before the
Yeah.
motion, there was this dispute that arose. Just I'll provide the context to go, not going into too much detail, um, because that's what precipitated emotions. Basically, my ex-wife decided to enroll our eldest son in a weekday Hebrew school program as he was
Mhm.
entering third grade. This is in addition to a Sunday school program she had both kids going to just on her weekends. My weekends, I take him to Bal Vihar. Now I take him. So Hebrew school is something a lot of Jews do to get their kids prepared for a bar or bat mitzvah, which is that ceremony where at age 13 they read some Hebrew from the Torah up on the bima. Uh, Now the duration of Hebrew school varies. Different people do different things. Some Jews do it for longer, some for less, some not at all, right? So that, like in a lot of religions, there's a wide variety of practices. But my ex wanted to schedule it right when it was offered by her synagogue for 5 years. That happens a lot. Given our second child was 2 years younger, and it was clear she was going to do that for him too, that basically this would be a 7-year thing, one or both kids being in Hebrew school. And that was all fine. Yeah, the problem was, this Hebrew school was going to be on one of my weekdays with the kids, and it
Mm.
would extend into the evening, whereas I typically picked them up in the afternoon. So I wouldn't get the kids for, something like 2.5 hours. So I obviously didn't like this for two reasons. First, I would lose significant time with my kids every week, only have them half the time. So of my 3.5 days on average, one day, every Wednesday evening, for to begin with, I wouldn't get them until the evening, which obviously impinges on a lot of things. Um, and that would happen for up to 7 years, right? So the other reason I didn't like it is part of those things it was going to impinge on was my own meditation practice with the boys, which was already compromised.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, Transcendental Meditation is the foremost way I practice my religion. I've been doing it for 27 years now, every day for 45 minutes a day, most days. Uh, it's the most important part of how I practice my religion. It's always been super important to me, that my kids get into it.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'd already taken them to the local Transcendental Meditation Center near where I live in New Jersey, where they started learning the technique. They're supposed to do it like me every day, twice a day. But not getting the kids until the evening would interfere with that, right? There's so much to do before bedtime, homework,
Mhm.
helping them with that,
Yeah, yeah.
reviewing it, dinner, some family time too, right? It can't just be all work.
No. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
so, and as they get older, the meditation becomes more of a commitment. You should do it a few hours before bedtime. So then I wouldn't even be able to have them do it at 5 p.m. or 5:30 before, you know, jujitsu starts at 6 or whatever, activity might be there. And I want to note the kids were already not able to do the meditation every day because my ex, you know, uh, wasn't really supporting it on her days. They were only doing it on my days. Uh, and I had come to accept that. We had this provision in our child support agreement. We're each responsible for our activities on our time. I thought that was our agreement, and that's kind of what we had come to.
Mhm.
Um, so they were already not doing it on her days, just on my days, and then to impinge on my remaining time with them for something that ideally is done every day, right? That just didn't seem right to me. So I initially tried to resolve this with my ex, with a mediator that we use helping, you know. it's a long story, but I won't get into all the details. But unfortunately, we were unable to complete those discussions, and I was left, I felt, with no choice but to file a motion,
Hmm.
uh, to protect something that was very important to me. Uh, and my view is that my ex-wife should just do this on her days, right? No problem with what she wanted to do. I
Yeah.
just want religions to be balanced, equal, but she wants to put him into, a weekday Hebrew school program, fine. But my view is she should do it on her days and either
Yeah.
use a private tutor or a different Hebrew school, and
Yeah.
there are
Yeah. Yeah.
multiple Hebrew schools in our town.
Yeah. Yeah.
That seemed to be the simplest thing to do to me. And then the kids could do both religious activities, hers and mine, and there wouldn't be any conflict, which would be good for them too. Uh, I have many near and dear Jewish friends. I spoke to a few of my really close ones, three of them, former roommate of mine from Israel, a couple other good friends, and they themselves suggested this. They also thought it wasn't necessary to do this much Hebrew school, but that if she really wanted to, it was not a big deal to use a different school or use a private tutor. One of my good friends used a private tutor for his kid and thought it was actually a better way to go,
Yeah. Yeah.
So oh, and by the way, I myself was using a private tutor to teach the kids some Hindi. I was only doing it on my days. So I thought she had alternatives, and I also felt that we had agreed to raise the children in both religions, and that all religions should be treated equally. Uh, and given that she wasn't really supporting my activity on her days, it didn't seem equal treatment to me, to be suddenly required to support her religious activity on my days.
Yeah.
So I felt this was a reasonable position to take. But my lawyer warned me that judges, again, going back to the systemic bias, he just told me, like, look, judges, they can pick and choose between activities when there's a conflict, even religious activities, again, based on what they deem to be in the child's best interests. And he warned me that it's commonly known, they tend to favor activities that they're more familiar with, like a bricks and mortar school versus a Hindu meditation practice.
Mm.
So I knew I might not get my way on this, but losing precious time with my sons every week for years was not acceptable to
Yeah.
me. And
Yeah.
after talking with my lawyers, I wanted to at least get a fair amount of makeup time, which, in my opinion, my ex wasn't giving me. So I filed a motion asking that my ex-wife conduct her religious activities with our boys on her time only. But I explicitly said in the motion that if, Your Honor, you disagree, at least give me hour for hour makeup time, right? For the time that I would lose every week for up to 7 years.
I
So
think
that's,
that
yeah.
that sounds pretty fair. She can do whatever she wants to do on her time. You do what you want to do on her time. So I mean, so what happened? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of the eye of the beholder. I'll get into that. So briefly, again, my point here is just to outline what was presented to a judge. People are free to make their own decisions
Mm.
as to who was right, who was wrong. Someone who's raised very much this way might interpret facts that way. Someone who's raised differently might interpret the facts a little
Mm.
differently. So it's not about who is fundamentally right or wrong. I just want to be clear about that. Just trying to focus on systemic bias and make it evident, at least to members of our community,
Yeah.
how things work and don't work. So anyhow, the way it works is when you file motions, you each get to file written briefs, taking your positions, making your points, and presenting your evidence. Again, I'm just going to cover what was presented
Yep.
to the court, not get into the weeds, just high level, and I'll try to present both sides fairly. So my underlying position was that we had always agreed that the children would be raised interfaith with both religions of equal importance. That was my recollection. We now had joint legal custody, 50-50 parenting time. And so both religious activities ought to be treated equally. And I went into detail on all my points. We each were raising the kids in our own religion, on our own time. We
Mm.
had the signed agreements that I've commented on, reflecting that, I believe. I had my lifelong meditation practice. The kids were now doing it. It was a Hindu religious practice. It was not being supported on my ex's days. And there would be further impingement if I couldn't get the kids till evening. And I also offered these alternatives that my ex had, citing my Jewish friends. My ex's underlying position, as I referred to, was pretty simple. We'd always agreed the children would be raised Jewish, either,
Wow.
well, that was her position, either entirely Jewish or predominantly Jewish, depending on how you interpreted her statements. And her activity of Hebrew school was required as part of being Jewish. And we had also joined the synagogue together. It was now their place of worship. And
Mm.
this Hebrew school was required by her synagogue. So that was, in a nutshell, her position. Again, very different views on what we had agreed to But again, there's no written agreement between us
Mhm.
on religious upbringing. And people's recollections and interpretations can vary. I don't wish to get into whether,
Yep.
she was right, I was right, she was wrong, I was wrong,
Yep. Got it.
um,
Yeah.
there's all this circumstantial evidence. But just so people can understand the systemic bias, I'll summarize the evidence that was presented to the judge, to the court, as fairly as I can.
Mhm.
Uh, my evidence was more documentary in nature. It included the kids' names, which are both Hindu and Jewish.
Mhm.
The order switched. It included our custody agreement, not definitive, but gave me the Hindu holidays and her the Jewish holidays. It included some old text and emails I found in which my ex referred to our family as interfaith and Jewish Hindu, and one in which she acknowledged that we had always agreed that the children could be raised Hindu if I desired, in addition to Jewish.
Oh, good. 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 And it was
Yeah,
in
I was
writing?
lucky to find that, I think. My ex's evidence was different. She and her lawyer really focused on the Jewish activities we did while married with kids, like having a
Mm.
bris,
Yeah.
which they described as the official entry into Judaism, putting
Wow.
the kids into a Jewish preschool, and then joining the synagogue, the Jewish celebrations we participated in, my interest in learning about her religion. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, there was an email in which I said, yeah, I would love to learn more about that. Stuff like that. They described me as having been more Jewish than Hindu. They included a picture of me wearing a yarmulke and said I didn't practice Hinduism at all during the marriage. Uh, they never addressed my meditation practice in writing in the brief. During oral arguments, her lawyer mentioned it once and told the judge that meditation was not religious, it was just for relaxation.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
Well, that's fine. That's their position. I'm not getting into whether one party was right or wrong. This isn't about that. It's really about uh, what information was presented to the court and how was that interpreted by the judge, and how would that same information have been interpreted by a different type of judge, one knowledgeable about Hinduism,
Mhm.
right?
Correct.
Uh, Things can be in the eye of the beholder. Not
Mhm.
getting into the fundamentals, just that angle. Uh, I think anyone in our community would agree that any Hindu American judge would have looked at all the evidence presented and not read into it, not read into my ex's evidence that the kids were always meant to be raised only Jewish. Whether it was my participating in Jewish activities, wearing a yarmulke on some such occasion, all those things, I think they would recognize that I was just being a good Hindu, in the
Yeah.
pluralistic way a lot of
Yep.
Hindus
Yep.
are.
Mhm.
So I think such a judge would also understand there is a lot of variety in how Hindus practice their religion. And that meanwhile, it is harder for a Hindu to do in this country to do all the things that a Christian or a Jew can do. And so I don't think there would be any expectation that I do the same type of activities for our religions to be of equally great importance to each of us.
Mhm.
I think such a judge would also know that meditation is of great significance in the Hindu religion. You know, uh, Lord Shiva, God of meditation, among other things. So my meditation practice would further support the importance of my Hindu faith. And I think it would have been viewed as a legitimate religious activity uh, for my kids, worthy of protection. So I think they would have discounted some of that evidence, and the remaining evidence would have been what carried weight, and that would have included, the kids' names, all our texts and emails that I mentioned, our agreements, which were supportive, I believe, and the fact that we had 50-50 custody, which gives you certain rights in New Jersey. And I think they would have concluded that uh, they should be giving equal consideration to the two competing religious activities. That's my view. But now, Dilipji, let's you and I come from this community, so we may both have a very strong view in one direction. Let's
Yep.
just do a thought experiment. Let's imagine, if you will, that you're a judge of Judeo-Christian background, okay, well-intentioned, highly intelligent, but you were always raised that way, maybe in the 60s or 70s before Indians were here, really. And you grew up in this country, you had family and friends attending churches and synagogues, and as you know, different denominations of Christianity even don't mix and share churches, right? Big difference between a Protestant and a Catholic, especially back then. Didn't always look kindly on each other, right? JFK being the first Catholic president was a big deal then. So, let's say that's how you grew up. and your friends and family were doing Sunday school or Hebrew school, getting confirmed, baptized, whatnot, if you're that kind of judge, maybe it was unthinkable. You couldn't imagine that a Jew could go through a baptism, right? That was just
Yep.
unthinkable.
Yep.
Or that a Christian could have a bar mitzvah. No, that didn't happen, right? That's your mindset. That's how you were raised. That's how you grew up.
Yep.
And and you and all your friends, Jewish or Christian, would never go pray to a different God if you actually were that religion, right? So that's the mindset. Let's say you're that type of judge, and then you see this evidence, and let's say you also didn't have any Indian friends,
Yep.
didn't
Yep.
think about Hinduism, really,
Mhm.
So you might hear all these stories of how we were celebrating Jewish rituals like a bris, which you always took as meaning something very definitive. You might look at a picture of me wearing a yarmulke, right, and think that, hey, this fellow, how Hindu is, how serious can he be about his own
Yep.
religion, right? And looks like they were raising the kids Jewish. He probably was on board with that decision. Now, these are things you're not supposed to say. So I think a judge may not want to say that openly, right? Because it doesn't
Mhm.
look good that the person representing the government is picking and choosing a religion. But you might think that, and you
Mhm.
might let it impact your decision making. And then not knowing anything about the history of meditation and how it originated in Hinduism, and only reading in Time magazine that it's this new way Americans are managing stress, and hey, it's backed by science. Then you might think that my calling it religious sounds like a made up story and frivolous.
Mhm.
And even though I wrote about all this at length in my brief, I wrote about Hinduism, the pluralism, I wrote about meditation and how it's a big part of Hinduism. This kind of judge with all these subconscious biases, they may not read it.
Yep.
Or if they read it, they might read it very skeptically, right? Kind of prejudged and dismiss it. I can't really say for sure. I don't know exactly what the judge's mindset was in my case. I don't want to overstep,
Yep.
but
Mhm.
I suspect that may have happened in my case. The judge basically ruled that the kids would be able to attend my ex's desired Hebrew school on my days. This was despite my just describing the impingement on my religious activity. But what's most significant, Dilip G, the real reason I'm here and have gone through this and am motivated to do something is that the judge went a step beyond that and declared that I had acted in bad faith for filing my motion and ordered that I pay my ex-wife's counsel fees as a result. And, that to me, with all respect to the judge, and, I don't think she was badly intentioned, but it was a step too far in terms of what she did. Not about the money, but about the message it sends, that here I am trying to protect a legitimate religious activity and I'm being declared in bad faith. Uh, and that really set me on this course, this investigatory course of trying to understand what really happened here, right? This doesn't compute. And then finding out that, oh, your child was declared to be Mormon because, or whatever the case was, right? So it's interesting. Anyhow,
Ah. So, uh, you have to pay your ex-wife's counsel fees, and the judge says you are in a bad faith.
yeah.
Wow. Whew.
Yeah.
I mean, here you try to be pluralist. You do so much. You go to that synagogue, you put on the yarmulke, you do allow chill having breeze, bar mitzvah. You are so open-minded. I guess being open-minded, meaning you are rewarded by being called bad faith. Wow.
It's one way to look at it. I had a divorce lawyer tell me once that in divorce court, no good deed goes unpunished. These
Oh,
things all set precedent. It extends across the board financially as well. But yeah, I kind of felt the same way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Uh, Further, what did you think of the judge ruling about allowing your ex to take the kids to Hebrew school?
I'm sorry, come again?
Uh, uh, you want to shed more on it? Why she said it's in bad faith?
Oh, well, in my opinion, the judge didn't really explain herself very well. So it's impossible for me to say exactly why. She did say that she thought my intention in filing the motion was to get in the way of my ex-wife's Hebrew school.
Mm,
She seemed to think that. But as to why she thought that, she didn't really explain herself. Didn't explain at all. I believe I had shown that we had a legitimate religious practice with which there was a conflict, timing conflict, and trying to protect that religious practice was obviously my intent. And
Mm,
that to me, by definition, can only be good faith. I also presented alternatives, which my own Jewish friends thought were acceptable. These included another Hebrew school. So from my perspective, how could my intention be to prevent the kids from attending a Hebrew school, and I'm offering Hebrew school as an alternative? Uh, Furthermore, my understanding is bad faith typically is ruled when a motion is considered frivolous. And one thing I forgot to say, the judge did do a good thing. She ruled against me on the first part of my motion, but she ruled for me on the second part, which was, at least I should get the hour for hour makeup time. So she granted that. And that was significant. Almost triple the amount of time my ex-wife was willing to give me. And I was happy about that. It all has to be taken in the summer. So it doesn't make up for the consistent weekly impingement on our time, our meditation time included.
mm,
But it was significant. And, to get significant time with my kids every year for the next several years, I mean, that made it worth it to me, at least as a consolation prize. So I would say the judge's own decision would indicate that my motion was justified. So I don't see how it was frivolous. Again, I can only guess at what the judge was thinking. Perhaps just guessing. Maybe she assumed my meditation practice was made up or frivolous. Maybe she didn't read what I wrote carefully. Maybe she believed my ex's position that we decided to raise the kids Jewish and didn't want to say it. But I don't really know. But I do know that everything in my motion was honest. There was nothing even shown to be inaccurate. Everything was also very respectful, as you could probably tell. So from any angle, I thought the bad faith part was, again, as I said, a step too far.
yeah, yeah. Think of the judge ruling about allowing your ex to take the children to Hebrew school on your days, on your supposed to be your teaching them about Hindu practices.
So I disagree with that too. But in all fairness to the judge, I do at least see a case that can be made for that. And here I think the judge did a somewhat better job explaining her decision, although it only covered one side's interest. The judge said we did join the synagogue offering the Hebrew school while we were married. And I do want to be fair and impress that upon people. It had become their synagogue, right? Different synagogues practice Judaism a little differently. The judge accepted that the synagogue required this Hebrew school program. She didn't address the alternative of a private tutor, but she said she didn't think it would be in the children's best interest to change to a different community, doing things a little differently, right? So fair position, I believe. However, the judge never mentioned my meditation practice. There was no mention of the importance of that for the kids, or the conflict presented by Hebrew school, or whether there was equal treatment, given that my practice wasn't really being supported by my ex on her days. So while the judge provided some explanation, it was just about one side, not the other side. So it still wasn't a good explanation in my view.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So for our viewers, I assume the judge was an American with a Judeo-Christian background. Do you think the judge might have been biased against Hindus? I mean, just hypothetical questions, or seems biased because of her ignorance about the Hindus and its practices?
Look, I don't know what it's like to be a family court judge. I hear, at least in New Jersey, that they're understaffed and overworked. There's a
Mhm.
shortage on the bench right now, is what I was hearing. And the state doesn't provide resources in the form of training or education to
Mm,
help them with these kinds of religious upbringing cases. So I would like to give this judge the benefit of the doubt and assume that she just wasn't knowledgeable about Hinduism. Uh, she also did give me the hour for hour makeup time, and that part of her decision was logical, and I agreed with, and it was a good outcome for me, that part. So she may not have been intentionally biased against me, in the sense of not liking our kind or something like that, but I can see how she might have been unintentionally biased, just because
mm,
of her upbringing, I'm guessing, and lack of knowledge about Hinduism, which I think is
mm.
clear. Uh, but it's understandable, right? Because this is pretty common. This happens. Even I would be, if I
Yeah.
was born and raised in India and didn't know anything about some Western faith, I'd be understandable. I didn't know all these things, right? But certainly, in my view, it ought to be rectified.
Yeah. So why decide to appeal then further?
So again, I disagreed that, I disagreed with the underlying decision. It was the finding of bad faith that, in my view, was a step too far. And that's what I'm really appealing. I'm not appealing the whole thing, mainly for practical reasons. The way New Jersey family law statutes are written, trial court judges, the judge I had, they're given a lot of discretion. And it's pretty well known, according to my lawyer, that the appeals courts don't want, they want to respect that discretion of the judge or the trial court judge. So they're loath to overturn decisions. So right or wrong, the vast majority of appeals lose. My lawyer thought that if I appealed the entire decision, my chances of winning were maybe 1 in 5. Now, the bad faith finding was completely, my lawyer thought it was completely ridiculous. And he felt I was on much stronger footing there. I mean, the judge gave me the hour for hour makeup time. So how could my motion be in bad faith? And I was defending a legitimate religious activity, which was never really shown to be otherwise. Uh, you know, but by focusing on just the bad faith finding, he felt my chances were better, maybe 50-50. He felt that this bad faith finding was clearly erroneous. That's a term used when rulings are overturned. So that's why I've appealed just the bad faith part. The main reason I've appealed is that I think this bad faith ruling sends a really dangerous message to our community. If you're a Hindu American, if you try to protect your religious rights via the legal process, you will be punished. That's the message, right? I mean, after this experience, I myself would tell any other Hindu American in a similar situation, hey, think twice about going to court because chances are you might get screwed. And I don't want you to waste your hard-earned money, but we shouldn't have to think that way, right? That's not right. So I felt that message by the government, no less, shouldn't be left to stand. That's what really motivated me. But, I'll say even with that, I was pretty close to walking away. I mean, this has taken a lot of time on my part, plus additional money. I'm lucky to be able to afford it, but one of my best friends, he's a Hindu, or actually a Jain. He advised me to walk away. He said, Raj, who cares if some judge called you names? You got more time with your kids. That's the important thing. And you have so much going for you. Why waste time on this? You could be, pick your battles. You could spend that time on making money and then do better things later. Right. And, that wasn't bad advice. It was good advice. I would respect anyone who followed that advice, but then I thought about the civil rights movement and look, obviously there's no comparison between my experience and the struggles that the African American community went through, right? No comparison. But just imagine if that's how all the African Americans felt, that, they shouldn't spend time protesting, right? When they were being discriminated against. They would still be sitting in the back of the bus today.
Yeah, correct.
And I don't think our religion should be sitting in the back of the bus. I
agree that whatever you are doing, it's there is so much more Hindu community has to learn from it.
I would agree. And look, just to pick up, I don't think any religion should be sitting in the back of the bus. I'm not here trying to impose my religion on anyone. I just think it's not being treated equally, right? And and meanwhile, I'm faced with this, in my view, a deeply uninformed, flawed decision that I think anyone in our community, at least, would agree shouldn't be allowed to stand. And I'm actually in a position to do something about it, right? No one else can appeal my case. I'm the only one who can. So I thought, let me just do something about it. It kind of feels like dharma, like.
So what do you think your chances of winning appeals are? Are there 50-50?
Well, I don't know. HAF, Hindu American Foundation, whom very well-respected organization. They actually, I got introduced to somebody there, spoke to him, and they read all my papers and agreed with me that this was very erroneous, bad decision. They actually wrote an amicus curiae. They spent money and wrote an amicus curiae brief for my case. These are, friends of the court briefs when there's an issue of public interest. I think that highlights how strong my case is for a prestigious organization like them to put their name and funding behind it. And I thought their brief was excellent and highlighted the constitutional issues better than I did. But the motion to appear was denied, by the appeals court without any real explanation, no detail, just a general citation of the statute. So that's a little worrisome to me. I look, I don't know how these things work precisely. I'm hopeful the appeals court will be better. The judges there are supposed to be better informed, higher quality even. On the other hand, no, I checked their names. None of the judges in the appellate division appear to be Hindu American. They all appear to have Judeo-Christian names, if I can make inferences like that. And there does seem to be a lot of judgment at play in terms like clearly erroneous or egregious. These are criteria you read, criteria by which an appeals court overturns a decision. So it's still highly subjective. And if those judges also have no idea that meditation is a big practice in Hinduism, and I don't know, will it be obvious to them that this bad faith finding is egregious, as I think any of us would find it, or will they end up deferring to the trial court judge? We'll have to see what happens. Again, I believe the vast majority of judges are well-intentioned, intelligent, and trying to do the right thing. I'm hopeful the appellate judges will read what I wrote, take the time to confirm that meditation is indeed a big deal in our community, if they don't already know that, and return a fair decision. But again, we'll have to see. If I lose, my mind's made up. I'll continue appealing because I have no doubt of the merits and the reason to do this. In some ways, maybe there'll be higher visibility, if it plays out that way. So we'll have to see what the universe wants.
So you feel there is a systemic bias there. Do you have anything specific in mind?
Oh, to address it, you mean? Yeah, I would say two things. I would say greater representation would help. If you look at New Jersey, this is the state with the highest percentage of Hindus, of any, even more so than California, believe it or not, probably, close to 5%. It's relatively easy for us to tell who has a Hindu American background thanks to our names. So I've gone through all the judges' names online. It looks like barely 1% of the judges in New Jersey have a Hindu American background.
Yep.
And among the family court judges specifically, it looks like there weren't any until a couple of years ago. And as I mentioned, there are none still on the appeals court. And this is New Jersey, right? Where we're probably 5% of the population. So we're really not represented among the judiciary. And if you look at what this country has done with police forces over the last few decades, obviously still not perfect, obviously, right? But many places have dramatically increased the percentage of Blacks and Latinos who serve as policemen, policewomen, to police the Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And that way the police have a better understanding of what's really going on, given the cultural differences and trust issues, and they can communicate better and get more cooperation. And this kind of, community policing initiative, everyone says it's done wonders. Again, long way to go, but it's certainly been a big improvement. And I don't see why this can't be done with the judiciary. And then perhaps have the Hindu American judges involved in religious upbringing cases that involve Hindu Americans, maybe in tandem with another judge, so there's no bias one way or another. And ditto for other religious minorities, right? This isn't just about us. But the other thing that can be done, which I think could be even more important, is requiring and providing education / training, right, for judges. Something that HAF would love to do, that I'm sure you would love to do, education on various religious practices, right? Tailored to the purpose of deciding these kind of cases on religious upbringing. Because it's going to take time to increase the representation of Hindu Americans in the judiciary. And there may be areas of the country where it's difficult. And education, I think, may be the best answer. Again, I do think most of the judges are well-intentioned, but we need to provide them resources so they can do their jobs better. I think they even would appreciate that. So, I mean, both these ideas simply boil down to one simple principle, which I don't think anyone should disagree with, that a judge shouldn't be expected to decide on the religious upbringing of somebody's child when the judge doesn't know enough about that person's religion.
Yep.
Right? To me, that's just common sense.
Yep.
Unfortunately, that's what's happening in this country today. And if it's too laborious to train all judges, then just train a subset and have them hear the religious upbringing cases. There's actually precedent for that when it comes to other types of cases, like domestic violence and sex crimes. There are more and more specialized courts for these kinds of cases because the people have recognized over time that the judges need special training for these types of cases. So, and these quote unquote courts are really just panels of judges who have that training. So I don't see why you couldn't easily do this with cases involving religious upbringing. I mean, we live in a time of increasing diversity. It's not the 60s anymore. And the judiciary needs to adapt to that. Seems like an easy reform to me. I think, again, anyone would be happy to provide that training. The legislature of each state would just have to pass a law. We now have, Hindu Americans in government, and we could make this apply to all religions. So that's what I have sort of landed on is what makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it sounds sensible. What do you think of chances of it will pass?
Well, I think it would be good. I just think, people have to understand this isn't just about protecting Hindu Americans. It's about protecting Americans of any less understood, historically underrepresented religion. And that might depend, right, on the area of the country and the type of judges. So it could apply to Jews. It could apply to Muslims. It could, it could be protective of them. It could be protective of Buddhists or even lesser known Christian denominations and sects. So any reform would need to be stated in a more general way, right? And it would apply to all religions. And so I would think we'd be able to get popular support because it benefits so many people collectively when you add them all up, and the religion itself doesn't matter. Again, a judge who knows nothing about a person's religious practices shouldn't be forced to decide on the religious upbringing of that person's child. It's just not fair to the parent. It's not fair to the child. It's not fair to the judge. They should be at least provided some resources and training so they can make a proper decision, which is what they want to do, I believe. I think this is just common sense, and it's not costly. It's mainly about doing things better, right? And benefits everyone. So we're obviously, I think, the most adversely affected because of our unique pluralism and all that. So I think we have the numbers as well. I think we're going to have to drive the change. It's our burden.
Yeah.
But I think that burden would also be an honor, right? For us to be able to do something that benefits so many people, other people too.
Okay, I guess it's already 2 hours. Let me ask, put it the closing one. If someone is a Hindu and in love relation with someone who is a Jewish or Christian, and is now just ready to tighten a knot, what plan for kids and wants to have a kids? What one message you would give them so they learn from your experience and imply in they make sure that they don't repeat the mistakes what you may have made?
Well, I clearly made my mistakes, so I'm not the best person to be giving gyan on this, but on the other hand, maybe people can learn from my mistakes. I would say the most important thing in general is to think, think through exactly how you would like to raise your kids. And there, again, like we said earlier, appreciate that passing on your traditions to your children almost always becomes more important once you have the actual children. Take that as a given, and that will take it as a given it'll happen to both you and your partner. And think about how that might play out. Having children is already stressful. It's going to be stressful as it is. You don't need more stress over religious upbringing, right?
Yep.
Planning to stay married. You want to make sure you set up your marriage for success, not failure. So now I'm not one of those people who says only marry your own kind, right? Things will be easier in some respects, right? Religion, culture, but the most important thing is to be happy, and whom you create a married life is a huge part of that, the individual. And certainly there are plenty of unhappy marriages where both partners are the same religion.
Yep.
So, but I think part of being a good match for the long term is being genuinely open-minded to the other person's traditions. So make sure that's the case, right? And make sure you are with their traditions and they are with yours. It works both ways, not being one-sided. And I want to be sensitive because I have so many friends of these other religions. But if your partner was raised in Abrahamic faith, just make sure that, make sure they're not going to gravitate towards the more exclusive traditions.
Yeah.
Ask them, will they be totally fine with your children praying to say, a Shivalinga? Or will there be some discomfort? Would they rather you convert, right? You should ask and find out these things. And if there will be some discomfort on their part, I think it makes sense to really explore that further, because people might say, yes, now I'm fine with interfaith, but are they really, right? So have that conversation. And I think you also have to observe and ask yourself questions like, how was she raised? How religious are her parents, her family? Does she have siblings? other relatives who are in successful interfaith marriages. You have to look at the person and you have to look at the pattern, right? Because people can also change.
Mhm.
Sometimes it may be very clear that there aren't going to be any issues. She could come from technically a Christian family, but she didn't go to church growing up. None of her family members go. There's no great nostalgia there. She loves meditation. She loves yoga. She calls herself a yogi, talks about her third eye or chakras or whatever. Then you're probably safe. But if she and her family have a very strong religious identity, Christian or whatever, she may agree while she's in love, but it could be a source of conflict later. So the other thing I would recommend is, hash that out, figure that out, and then in addition, regardless of which way it goes, get the commitment in writing with enough detail, ideally, so it's clear to both parties what it means. Like, which holidays will you celebrate? Will there be religious schooling, and what type, and how will you juggle the activities? And there, keep in mind the systemic bias and how many of the judges view things. They place weight on things that resemble typical Judeo-Christian activities. Hinduism doesn't require anything, but put in some Hindu ceremonies, whether it's a mundan or a thread ceremony, count on visiting a temple regularly. Keep it as equal as possible, I would advise, exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
And, if you and your partner don't have any clear idea yet of your respective religious activities, seems like too much of a chore to try to define this in advance. You don't even know if you can have kids, right? Sometimes. Then write that down. Write down that you don't know, right? That way, neither party can come back later and say you had always agreed to this or that. Say that you don't know exactly what you're going to do, but that you're assuming equal respect for both religions, no matter what happens.
Yeah.
That's what I would advise. And if you do this, then hopefully, like I was saying, hopefully you both feel secure enough that you both can have, these fun celebrations, right, of each other's religious ceremonies, whether it's a bar mitzvah or a mundan or whatnot. And then I would say last thing, I know it's more than one, but, consider, people don't like to do this, but consider what happens if you divorce. Will you continue to honor the interfaith commitment, right? And as part of that, you may want to discuss expectations on custody, because in some states, like New Jersey, if you have minority custody, you don't have as many rights on religious upbringing. And I think once you start discussing all these things in detail, it's possible you could find there's more potential for conflict than you initially thought. And then you can at least make an informed decision. And if you are able to agree, then at least you have some commitment that could have some force if you get divorced, right? But more importantly, it hopefully serves as a guide for both you and your partner as to how you're going to behave, and maybe even keeps you out of divorce. So that's what I would advise. But, Dilipji, I think the reality is you and I can recommend all these things, but how many people are going to follow them, right? And that's where love is blind. People don't listen. And I think that's where we have to, together with other members of the community, try to reform the system, to protect our community, protect our children, grandchildren. So hope that helps.
Nope. Great. Thank you very much for this interview. It has been great talking to you. And thank you for sharing your really, really difficult experience. I mean, that's really hard. And again, reminding people that we don't have any intention of saying anything bad about any other faith, different faiths, criticizing any practices. But you are in love, ultimately, somehow conflict do come. And like Raj said beautifully, that make fully informed decisions. Clearly know what you're getting into it, then hopefully you will have an everlasting happy married life. So
Yep. Well, thank you, Dilipji. I appreciate, this was fun, and I appreciate all your help and everything you're doing for the community.
Nope, great. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we are concluding the presentations. Thank you.